A woman who stops pleasing men. Let me start with a simple idea. We become who we're expected to be, until we choose to become who we truly are. Now imagine a woman who was taught, subtly, repeatedly, that her worth is in how agreeable she is, how likable she is, how beautiful she looks when smiling at someone else's joke that isn't funny. She learned to say yes when she meant no, to stay silent so others could speak, to make herself small so others could feel big. But one day something changed, not in the world, because the world still tells women to please. Many women grow up in a world that teaches them, directly or indirectly, that their value lies in how much they can please others, especially men. This lesson starts early. It's found in the compliments we give little girls for being nice and quiet, in the way media portrays female characters who are adored only when they're agreeable or beautiful, and in the subtle encouragement to smile, to accommodate, to not rock the boat. Over time, this conditioning becomes a quiet habit, almost invisible but deeply ingrained. A woman learns to say yes even when every part of her wants to say no. She laughs at jokes that aren't funny. She minimizes her achievements so others won't feel threatened. She apologizes not for what she's done, but for simply existing in a way that might disrupt someone else's comfort. And the saddest part, it doesn't feel like self-abandonment, it just feels normal. But here's the truth. Every time a woman shapes herself to meet someone else's expectations, especially to gain approval from men, she trades a small piece of her authenticity for acceptance. And it doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual. It's in the way she keeps quiet during a meeting because she doesn't want to seem bossy. It's in the way she lets a disrespectful comment slide because she doesn't want to cause tension. It's in the way she puts everyone's needs before her own because she was told that being selfless is what makes her good. This cycle of people pleasing isn't just exhausting, it's dangerous, because after years of doing it, a woman may begin to lose sight of who she is. She becomes so used to being what others want her to be, she forgets what she wants for herself. Her desires become distant whispers. Her voice fades under the weight of constant compliance. And she wonders why she feels so disconnected, so frustrated, so tired, despite doing everything she was told would make her lovable and successful. And let's be clear, this isn't about demonizing men. It's about a culture that rewards women for shrinking themselves and punishes them for taking up space. It's about recognizing that the need to please is often rooted in fear, the fear of being disliked, misunderstood, rejected. But here's the breakthrough, that fear only has power when a woman believes that someone else's approval is more important than her own truth. When a woman finally decides to stop pleasing men, it's not an act of rebellion, it's an act of coming home to herself. It's her saying, I am no longer available for the performance. It's not about becoming rude or disrespectful, it's about becoming real, and in that decision, something profound happens. She starts to trust her own voice. She begins to honor her own boundaries. She chooses relationships, careers, and conversations where she can be fully seen, not just tolerated or used. This shift doesn't make life easier, but it makes it truer. And in truth, there is freedom. Yes, she may lose people along the way. Some will call her difficult, cold, or too much. But those are just the labels used to try to pull her back into the box she finally broke out of. The people who matter, the ones who value depth, honesty, and strength, will not be intimidated by her authenticity. They will be drawn to it. In the end, a woman who stops pleasing others, especially men, isn't becoming someone new. She's finally becoming herself. And that, in a world that tries so hard to shape her, is the most radical thing she can do. When a woman decides to stop pleasing men, many misunderstand her choice. Some view it as rebellion, as if she's trying to fight the system, hurt people, or prove a point. But in reality, her decision comes from a far deeper and more powerful place: self-respect. It's not about pushing others away. It's about finally drawing herself closer. It's about recognizing her own worth without waiting for someone else to validate it. Self-respect is a quiet, steady force. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't seek to dominate or to make anyone feel small. It simply refuses to shrink. It's about standing firm even when it would be easier to bend. It's about listening to your own needs and valuing them, even when the world teaches you to prioritize everyone else's. A woman raised to please others often learns that being liked is everything. She learns to be agreeable to avoid conflict, to be pretty to be admired, to be accommodating to be accepted. For a long time, it feels easier to play along. It feels safer to keep smiling and saying yes. But deep down, something feels hollow. Because no matter how much approval she collects, it never quite fills the space inside that longs to be seen, heard, and honored for who she really is. Choosing self-respect over pleasing is not about arrogance. It's not about walking around with a chip on her shoulder. It's about saying, I am enough, exactly as I am. I do not need to perform for your affection. I do not need to sacrifice myself for your comfort. That is a deeply courageous choice, especially in a world that still whispers, be small, be sweet, don't make anyone uncomfortable. When a woman stops pleasing men, she is no longer measuring her worth by how much she can make others happy. She's no longer twisting herself into versions that feel more palatable, more acceptable. She is no longer bargaining with her dignity in exchange for scraps of approval. She knows now. If love, respect, or acceptance must be earned by pretending to be something she is not, it is not love, respect, or acceptance at all. This shift is subtle but life-changing. It shows up in the way she speaks up even when her voice shakes. It shows up when she says no without a lengthy apology. It shows up when she walks away from conversations, relationships, or environments that require her to hide her power. And every time she honors herself in these small, everyday moments, she builds a new foundation. Life not built on pleasing others, but on living in truth. Of course, this decision doesn't come without cost. Not everyone will applaud her self-respect. Some will criticize her. Some will distance themselves. Some will label her as too difficult, too emotional, too independent. But that's okay, because the goal was never to be everything to everyone. The goal is to be everything to herself. Self-respect is choosing alignment over acceptance. It's choosing peace over performance. It's waking up every morning knowing you are proud of who you are, not because you met someone else's standards, but because you honored your own. And here's the beautiful part. When a woman lives with that kind of integrity, she doesn't just change her own life. She lights the way for others. She shows her friends, her daughters, her community that it's not only okay to stand tall, it's essential. A woman who stops pleasing men is not angry. She is awake. She is not cold. She is clear. And she is not rebellious. She is responsible for herself, her energy, and her future. And that, in the truest sense, is what self-respect looks like. It is not loud. It is not boastful. It is not harsh. It is steady, certain, and quietly revolutionary. When a woman stops living to please men, one of the most unexpected and powerful shifts begins to happen. The wrong people start to fall away, and the right ones begin to appear. It's not magic, and it's not coincidence. It's alignment. Because when someone stops performing, when they stop editing themselves to be accepted, they begin to create space for relationships built on something far more lasting than approval, truth. For so long, many women are conditioned to wear masks. These masks are shaped by what others expect. Be agreeable, be attractive, be low maintenance, be nice. And wearing these masks often brings a certain kind of success. People like her, she fits in, she's admired, but deep down that admiration feels conditional. It's not for who she is, it's for how well she plays the part, and playing that part day after day, year after year, becomes exhausting. Eventually, some women hit a breaking point. Not because they're angry, but because they're tired of feeling unseen, unheard, and misunderstood in relationships that only function when they stay small. And when they decide to stop pleasing, that's when everything begins to change. Suddenly, the relationships that were built on her compliance, her silence, or her constant giving start to fall apart. That's not failure, that's clarity. Those connections were never rooted in her true self. They were rooted in her performance. When she stops performing, those bonds dissolve. It can feel painful, even lonely at first, but it's also liberating. Because the space those people once occupied can now be filled by those who see her clearly and choose her not for what she does for them, but for who she is. This isn't just about romantic relationships either. It's about friendships, workplaces, families. Any relationship that thrives on one person diminishing themselves to keep the peace will not survive a woman choosing to live in her full power. But those that are grounded in mutual respect and authenticity, those will thrive. They may be fewer in number, but they are infinitely more fulfilling. When a woman starts living without the burden of pleasing, she begins to speak more honestly. She sets boundaries. She honors her intuition. She walks away from conversations and situations that feel depleting. And in doing so, she begins to attract people who aren't intimidated by her truth, but inspired by it. People who don't just tolerate her strength, but respect it. People who value her no as much as her yes. It's one of the most beautiful paradoxes. The more a woman chooses herself, the more deeply she becomes available for real connection. Not surface level attachment, not admiration based on appearance or convenience, but connection based on who she is at her core. Her relationships deepen not because she's giving more, but because she's being more. Of course, this shift requires courage, because letting go of people, even the wrong people, can feel like loss. There may be moments of doubt, moments where she wonders, did I do the right thing? But over time, the answer becomes clearer. The people who remain, who stay when she's no longer bending, performing, or pleasing, are the ones who see her fully and love her freely, and those relationships, they are worth everything. They are the kind of connections that nourish rather than drain, that challenge rather than control, that celebrate rather than consume. So when a woman stops pleasing men, she is not choosing isolation, she is choosing alignment. And in that alignment, she finds her people, the ones who don't need her to be smaller, the ones who aren't frightened by her strength, the ones who are drawn not to who she pretends to be, but to who she actually is. And for the first time, she realizes that is enough. She is enough, just as she is. When a woman begins to live from a place of self, truth rather than approval, seeking something inevitable happens. She begins to speak up, set boundaries, and protect her energy. And almost instantly, the world responds, not always with applause or gratitude, but often with discomfort, criticism, and judgment. She's called too much, too emotional, too independent, or too cold. But what's really happening is this. Her courage is unsettling to those who benefit from her silence. For much of her life, a woman is taught, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly, that to be good is to be agreeable. She learns that her value lies in her ability to go along, to smooth things over, to prioritize harmony over honesty. Saying no is frowned upon. Expressing anger is discouraged. Standing firm is mistaken for being difficult. And so she adapts. She softens her voice, filters her opinions, and shrinks her presence. All of it in the hope of being accepted, liked, and loved. But there comes a moment, sometimes after years of burnout, heartbreak, or simply exhaustion, when she begins to question it all. She asks herself, what if being liked isn't worth losing myself? What if saying what I really think doesn't make me unkind? It makes me honest, and from there a shift begins. She starts to speak in ways she once avoided. She says no, without over-explaining. She stands firm in situations where she would have once backed down. She walks away from disrespect, not because she wants to cause conflict, but because she has finally learned she deserves better. And this new way of living, it's powerful, but it's also met with resistance. The people around her, used to her compliance, now find her boundaries inconvenient. They push back, they label her, they accuse her of being too strong, too proud, too sensitive. But none of this is actually about her. It's about how uncomfortable truth feels to those who are only comfortable with control. Being misunderstood becomes part of the journey. It stings, but it doesn't stop her. Because she now knows something deeper, her voice matters. Her boundaries are valid. Her emotions, even when intense, are not a flaw. They are a compass. And the more she listens to that compass, the more clearly she sees the difference between being nice and being true. Setting boundaries doesn't make her cold. It makes her clear. Expressing hurt doesn't make her weak. It makes her honest. Saying, "I deserve better," doesn't make her arrogant. It makes her self-aware. Yet in a culture that rewards female silence and calls it grace, that celebrates self-sacrifice and calls it love, any woman who dares to defy that script is seen as a problem. But here's the truth. Her willingness to be misunderstood is not a weakness. It's a mark of growth. Because she no longer measures her integrity by how others perceive her. She doesn't need to be everyone's cup of tea. She doesn't fear being too much for people who were never meant to hold her depth. In fact, her too much is just enough for the life she's meant to live. She becomes a mirror, reflecting back to others where they have settled, compromised, or stayed small, and not everyone will thank her for it. But those who are ready for truth, for depth, for real connection, those people will rise to meet her, not because she changed to fit them, but because she dared to be exactly who she is. And in the end, that is the quiet revolution of a woman who stops living to please. She will be called many things, but most of all, she will be free. Leadership is often misunderstood. We tend to associate it with titles, roles, or how many people follow someone. But real leadership, the kind that transforms lives, is something quieter, deeper, and far more personal. It begins with self-mastery. And there is no clearer example of this than a woman who stops living to please others and starts living in alignment with her truth. When a woman decides to stop pleasing men, not to provoke, but to preserve herself, she is taking one of the most courageous leadership steps possible. She is choosing to lead not from ego, not from performance, but from integrity. She's no longer outsourcing her self-worth to someone else's opinion. Instead, she is anchoring her life in self-respect, clarity, and authenticity. This kind of leadership doesn't always look like what we expect. It doesn't always involve a stage, a microphone, or a team. Sometimes it looks like a woman quietly refusing to tolerate disrespect in her relationships. It looks like her choosing not to laugh at a joke that belittles her, not to smile when something feels off, not to stay in spaces that shrink her. These are not small acts. They are leadership decisions. Because every time she honors herself, she sends a message. This is what I believe is acceptable. This is the standard I choose to live by. And in doing so, she leads by example. She may not ask others to follow, but they often will. Why? Because truth is magnetic, because authenticity gives others permission to examine their own lives, because someone who chooses courage over compliance becomes a mirror, a quiet challenge to the status quo. What sets her apart is not just her strength, but her consistency. She doesn't just demand better treatment, she embodies it. She doesn't just talk about self-worth, she lives it, and this level of congruence, where her values match her choices, is the foundation of real leadership. It's not about controlling others. It's about controlling her own responses, her own energy, and her own narrative. And here's where it gets powerful. Leadership through self-mastery creates ripples. When one woman sets a boundary, it gives another woman permission to do the same. When one woman walks away from a toxic dynamic, it forces others to question what they're still tolerating. When one woman refuses to dim her light, others feel brave enough to turn theirs on. This isn't about rebellion. It's about responsibility, not to a role, but to a purpose. Leadership isn't about being perfect or unshakable. It's about being rooted. The woman who has mastered herself may still feel fear, doubt, or uncertainty, but she doesn't let those things run her life. She feels them, faces them, and chooses with clarity. That's strength. That's emotional intelligence. That's maturity. And those are the traits of someone who can lead, not just others, but herself through any situation. It's important to realize that this kind of leadership is often lonely at first. Not everyone understands it. Some will criticize her. Others will fall away. That's okay. She's not leading for applause. She's leading because she has finally stopped betraying herself for the sake of fitting in. And she knows now, if she has to shrink to be accepted, it's not a space she wants to belong to. Over time, the loneliness fades and is replaced by something better: community, real connection, relationships rooted in mutual respect, opportunities that align with her values, not just her skills, and a life that feels honest and fulfilling, not performative and exhausting. The woman who stops pleasing others to master herself is not loud, but she is undeniable. She doesn't need attention to make an impact. Her presence speaks for her. Her boundaries lead for her, and her example teaches others more than words ever could. That's what leadership really looks like. When one woman makes the decision to stop pleasing others, especially men, it might seem at first like a personal transformation. Something quiet, something internal. But the truth is, that single decision has the power to ripple out far beyond her own life. Because when one woman stops apologizing for her truth, when she begins to honor her voice, her worth, and her boundaries, she doesn't just change herself. She becomes a living invitation for others to do the same. We live in a world where so many women have been taught to be small, not directly perhaps, but in all the subtle messages they've absorbed. Don't be too loud, don't take up too much space, don't make anyone uncomfortable. Smile more, say yes, be easy to love, be easy to manage, and for generations women have internalized this script. They've bent and twisted themselves into more acceptable versions, not because they're weak, but because they were surviving. Because that's what they were taught they had to do to belong. But when even one woman stops playing that game, she interrupts the cycle. She shows a different way. She becomes proof that it's not only possible to live without approval, it's necessary for freedom. The moment a woman says, "No more," something profound happens. She begins to reclaim her time, her energy, her choices. She stops filtering her opinions to sound more likable. She stops dressing, speaking, or behaving for the comfort of others. She begins to ask herself not, "What do they want from me?" but "What do I want for myself?" And that one shift, from external validation to internal alignment, is revolutionary. This woman becomes a lighthouse. She doesn't have to preach. She doesn't need to convince anyone. Simply by existing in her truth, she lights the way for others. Her courage becomes contagious. Her strength becomes an example. Friends around her begin to reconsider their own boundaries. Daughters begin to internalize a different kind of model. Coworkers begin to notice what it looks like when someone leads from authenticity, not approval. Because here's what's often missed. Every act of self-respect is a form of leadership. Every time a woman chooses her dignity over convenience, every time she prioritizes her well-being over social expectations, she is not just changing her life, she is creating a new blueprint. She's redefining what it means to be a woman in a world that often asks her to forget herself. And this kind of influence, it doesn't require a platform, it doesn't require permission, it simply requires one thing: truth. When a woman stands in her truth, she challenges everyone else to consider where they've been hiding. She forces people to confront their own masks. Some will feel threatened by that. Others will feel awakened, but no one will be unchanged. This is the legacy of a woman who stops pleasing. She becomes a mirror, a model, a message. She doesn't need to fight others. Her very existence becomes a quiet form of rebellion, not against people, but against the systems and expectations that have told her for too long that she must earn her place in the world by performing. As more women make this choice, the ripple becomes a wave. A cultural shift begins. What once seemed radical, setting boundaries, speaking up, choosing rest, demanding respect, becomes normalized, and the next generation grows up in a world where authenticity is not feared but celebrated. So yes, when one woman chooses herself, it changes everything. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a real and lasting one. It's how revolutions begin, not with noise, but with truth. Not with mass movements, but with individual choices made in quiet rooms, in hard conversations, in brave moments. One woman's freedom becomes the seed for another's, and that is how collective change begins. One voice, one truth, one woman at a time.